October 1991. Garden Lodge. Brian May arrived for one of his regular visits during a period when Freddie Mercury's condition had confined him almost entirely to bed. The specific rhythm of these final weeks organized around brief windows of clarity that arrived unpredictably, and that everyone in the household had learned to recognize and accommodate whenever they occurred. Brian has described, in the limited interviews where this particular visit has come up, finding Freddie in one of these clearer periods that October afternoon, propped against pillows in the specific configuration that had become standard. His voice weaker than it had been even a few weeks earlier, but his mind, according to Brian's characterization, remaining sharp and focused despite his body's continued decline. Brian settled into the chair positioned beside the bed, a specific spot that had become, across the preceding months, almost entirely his own within the small rotation of chairs that accommodated Freddie's various visitors. And the conversation began, according to Brian's account. In the ordinary register that had characterized most of their recent visits, updates on the band's continued work, small pieces of news from the outside world that Freddie apparently still wanted to hear, even as his own capacity to participate in that world had narrowed so dramatically. The conversation's shift, according to Brian's account, arrived without significant warning. Freddie's tone changing mid-sentence in a way that Brian has said he had learned to recognize across the preceding months as signaling something Freddie considered genuinely important rather than simply the ordinary flow of casual visiting conversation. Freddie asked Brian, according to this account, whether he remembered a specific song from relatively early in the band's catalog. A track that Brian has confirmed existed among Queen's officially released material, without ever specifying, across any interview where this conversation has come up, exactly which song Freddie was referencing, maintaining a specific and consistent discretion regarding this detail that mirrors similar patterns of protective silence documented across several other fragments of testimony from Freddie's final months. Brian confirmed, according to his account, that he remembered the song clearly, and Freddie's next question, delivered according to Brian's characterization with unusual directness, asked whether Brian would do something for him regarding that specific piece of music, a request Freddie apparently prefaced by acknowledging, according to Brian's recollection, that what he was about to ask might seem strange or even difficult to honor given the song's place within the band's broader catalog and its history of audience reception. "I need you to never play it again," Freddie said, according to the version of this account that Brian has offered with the most consistency across the limited interviews where he has addressed this specific conversation. "Not at any show, not on any record you make after I'm gone, not even if fans request it, not even if it feels like it would be an easy way to please a crowd. I need that particular song to end with me. I need you to promise me that." Brian has described his own immediate reaction to this request as a specific kind of confusion. The recognition that this particular song had never been, by any measure he could identify, among Queen's most commercially significant or most frequently performed material, making the intensity of Freddie's request feel, in the moment, somewhat disproportionate to whatever the song's actual public significance might have suggested. A disconnect that Brian has said prompted him to ask Freddie directly why this particular piece of music, out of the band's entire extensive catalog, carried this specific and urgent weight. Freddie's explanation, according to Brian's account, addressed something he had apparently never previously discussed with any member of the band. A specific personal history connected to the song's original composition that predated its actual studio recording and public release, involving, according to Brian's careful and deliberately limited characterization, a particular period of Freddie's life and a particular person whose connection to the song's creation Freddie had apparently kept entirely private across the more than 15 years since its original release. "He told me the song wasn't really about what everyone assumed it was about," Brian has recounted. In the version of this description that has appeared most consistently across his various accounts, he said the actual inspiration was something considerably more personal, something he'd never told anyone, not the band, not any journalist across all these years of interviews, and that every time it got played, every time an audience sang along, without knowing what they were actually singing about, it felt like watching something private get performed as though it belonged to everyone, when really it had only ever belonged to him and to one other person who would never actually get to hear it played again in the specific way it was originally meant. Brian has never, across any interview addressing this conversation, specified the particular person or particular circumstance Freddie referenced, maintaining a discretion regarding this detail that he has characterized as an explicit continuation of the same protection Freddie apparently requested for the song itself, understanding the request not simply as being about the music, but about protecting a specific piece of private history that the song had, in ways the public never fully understood, always actually represented. Brian has described asking, according to his own account, whether Freddie wanted him to explain this reasoning to Roger and John, whether the request for permanent retirement of this particular song required some broader band consensus given that decisions about the group's future performing catalog had, across their entire working history, typically involved collective agreement among all members rather than any single person's individual instruction. Freddie's response, according to Brian's account, addressed this question directly, indicating that Brian could share the fact of the request itself with Roger and John, could tell them that Freddie had specifically asked that this particular song never be performed again, but that Freddie preferred the underlying reasoning, the specific personal history connected to the song's true inspiration, remained known only to Brian, a distinction that Brian has said he understood immediately and has honored completely across the more than 3 decades since, confirming in various interviews that Roger and John are aware of the general request without ever having been told by Brian or by anyone else the specific personal history that originally prompted it. This particular structure, Freddie apparently distinguishing between the fact of an instruction and its underlying private justification, mirrors a broader pattern documented across several other fragments of testimony from his final months. Various people receiving pieces of information calibrated specifically to what Freddie understood they needed to know, versus what he wanted to remain protected within a considerably smaller circle of trust. Brian has confirmed, across every available interview addressing Queen's post-1991 performing history, that this particular song has never, in fact, been performed by any configuration of the band across more than 3 decades of continued touring and recording, including the extensive Queen plus Adam Lambert performances that have, across the years since 2011, revived and performed a substantial portion of the band's classic catalog for new generations of audiences, a specific and consistent omission that Brian has confirmed is deliberate, connected directly to the promise he made to Freddie during this particular October 1991 conversation, though he has consistently declined, across every interview where the subject has arisen, to identify the specific song involved, understanding this ongoing anonymity as itself part of the promise's continued fulfillment. If I named it, Brian has said, according to the version of this quote that has circulated most widely among people who have encountered this story, people would immediately start analyzing it, trying to figure out who it might be about, treating exactly the private thing Freddie asked me to protect as a puzzle to be solved. That's precisely what he didn't want. So I just don't play it, and I don't say which one it is, and honestly, after this many years, most people don't even notice the specific absence, because our catalog is so large that one missing song among so many doesn't draw the kind of attention it might if we only had a handful of tracks to choose from. This particular explanation for maintaining the song's anonymity, the recognition that identifying it would itself constitute exactly the kind of exposure Freddie's original request had been designed to prevent, has been characterized by people who study Freddie's broader pattern of privacy management as consistent with the specific and careful logic that appears to have governed several of his other final month private instructions. A recurring pattern of protecting not simply information, but the specific conditions under which that information might otherwise become subject to public speculation and analysis. The specific emotional weight of this conversation, occurring according to Brian's account during one of Freddie's clearer and more articulate final weeks, has been characterized by Brian across the limited interviews, addressing it as one of the more difficult private moments of his entire friendship with Freddie, precisely because of what it revealed about the specific gap between public understanding of the band's catalog and the actual, considerably more private history that had informed at least one significant piece of music within it. Brian has said, in the account he has offered most consistently, that he found himself reconsidering, in the years following Freddie's death, several other songs within the band's catalog, wondering whether similar private histories might exist behind other tracks that the public had long since settled into confident interpretations about. A specific and ongoing uncertainty that Brian has characterized as one of the more subtle but persistent forms of grief he has carried across the decades since. The recognition that even after everything he learned across more than 20 years of close collaboration with Freddie, there apparently remained entire dimensions of meaning within their shared creative work that Freddie had kept entirely private until this specific and deliberately chosen final disclosure. Freddie Mercury died approximately 6 weeks after this particular conversation, and Brian has said that he has thought, across more than 3 decades since, about the specific timing of Freddie's decision to finally share this piece of information, wondering whether the approaching end of his life had simply made the burden of carrying this particular secret alone feel less sustainable, or whether Freddie had always intended to share it with Brian specifically at some point, waiting only for the right moment and the right level of trust before finally offering an explanation that connected a piece of the band's public catalog to a dimension of his private life that had, across more than 15 years since the song's actual release, remained completely and successfully hidden from public knowledge and speculation. Whatever the specific reasoning behind its timing, Brian has honored the request with complete consistency across the more than 3 decades since, maintaining both the song's permanent absence from Queen's performed catalog and the complete privacy of its specific identity and its true underlying inspiration, a promise that has, by every available indication, become one of the more significant and most carefully protected pieces of private testimony connected to Freddie Mercury's final months. Existing today as a specific and deliberately maintained silence within an otherwise extensively documented and endlessly analyzed catalog of music, one song among dozens that the public has simply never been permitted to hear performed again, protected by a friend who understood exactly what that specific silence was actually protecting. Even while the millions of people who have continued celebrating Freddie Mercury's musical legacy across the decades since his death have had no way of knowing that one particular piece of that legacy was, by deliberate and permanent choice, never going to be part of what they were allowed to experience live again.